Dear colleagues, let us start our session. Please close the doors, and those who want will come later and join us. Again, I'm happy to welcome you at St. Petersburg Legal Forum today. We're going to discuss the formats of regulation of business environmental standards. Probably it is academical as it is science, but due to two circumstances, it seems quite practical to me. First, it is related with my activities. I'm head of the law service of Sibur company. And we regard environmental problems as quite important ones for our company that is working in industry, and we perceive it in a similar way for each industrial company in Russia due to different circumstances, due to the Soviet heritage, which giant companies and not only giant companies have. These problems are quite topical from the viewpoint of public opinion perception of these problems by the state. The second theme, which testifies to the fact that today's discussion is quite important, is that in this field the legislation changes significantly. Those changes in the legislation can also be digitized. They can also be translated into the language of millions and billions of rubles, which the companies have to spend. And despite the academic nature of the theme, seeing the speakers and the statements that they're going to make, I think that we might have a practical panel discussion, and I ask the audience to participate actively in our discussion. I would offer the following agenda to our speakers. I will represent you by names, and I will call the companies which you represent, and the themes of your presentation will be given. So, Kirill, I ask Kirill Samarukov to start his presentation. Kirill has got a presentation. It will be displayed on the screen. Kirill, please take the floor.
Okay. Kirill Samarukov.
Kirill Samarukov, Valdai Hudson, New York. We have long been attracting foreign investments in Russia. We have been working with different regions, and we faced a certain problem related with environmental protection when the projects are initiated. And now I would like to cover the theme. I'm going to talk about ecological risks and project financing, their transformation to administrative, political, legal risks, and the so-called risk of the long-term expropriation. I have just been attending the project financing roundtable in another conference room. They covered different aspects, but they didn't highlight on the environmental aspect. So I think it will be quite interesting. Direct foreign investments, foreign direct investments, are the investments made by the person from one country to a company from other country. They differ from indirect portfolio investments that are in free circulation in the market. They are characterized by higher share of participation in the company, more than 10%, and more active control. Direct foreign investments are characterized by creating long-term stable relations between the economies of the countries. They are the key element of international economic integration. They favor the exchange of technologies, and for the developing markets, they give a significant advantage. They are an important engine of the economic development of the recipient country. There are two common indices of foreign direct investments, that is confidence index and index of regulatory restrictions or limitations. In this case, unfortunately, you cannot see them clearly. As to the confidence index, Russia ranks 11th. As to the regulatory restrictions index, the situation is a bit worse. Russia shows the level above medium one, that is not good, and then we'll pass on to project financing. Project financing is the structure of financing which takes into account of the future cash flows of the specific project as the main source for repayment. It is most often used to create large resource-intensive projects, but at the municipal level, the projects at the level of $30 to $50 million can be financed based on the same principle. In project financing, risks are divided into 14 to 16 categories, and ecological risk, political risk, risk of military actions, and political and social instability, which is of not great interest to us, and the sanctions are quite important, and nationalization and expropriation. The legal risk is the risk of legal persecution. Ecological, environmental risks that might be related to emissions, accidents, and context. Context in this case is not clearly determined and is interpreted quite broadly. That is the place of the project in the ecological, physical, and cultural and sociological environment. Cultural and sociological environment is how the population regards the project, whether we need it or not, what would be the benefit of the project. If you have initiated the project, that is a real pain in the neck, and you are aware of that. Stages of the project that are subject to environmental risks: initiation, approval, attraction of investors, building and development of the project, and so on, up to liquidation. Liquidation is when, for instance, the project didn't advance, some of the work has been done, and the investor rejects the project and abandons it, never moving forward. Project participants subject to environmental risks. These are sponsors, initiator of the project, attracted investors, debt investors, short-term and long-term investors, those who provide quasi-capital, companies, contractors, a broad range of participants of the project, those who directly and indirectly are related with the project. So what is the public position? How is it characterized? It is used quite extensively. As a rule, there is a certain initiators or several initiators who gather in public. Then they organize an informal group and they counterpose or counteract the project. They lodge complaints, different instances, including the governor. And this is practically a common situation, not only for Russia, but for the USA as well. As a rule, they emphasize the environmental aspect, though it is not always the main one. Political, labor aspects are also taken into account as a rule, but they are masked by the environmental aspect because that is the most vulnerable theme. Then, for the laws which draw up the documents and the documents are based on 14 or to 16 categories of risks, which I have previously discussed, depending on the level of the tolerance of the authorities and public pressure, the value of the political risk might be determined. So when, for instance, all the approvals have been received, theoretical and practical, and there is a certain agreement with local authorities, and all of a sudden the public the public asks the question, what if you have bought everything and so on? So the public hearings on the projects are often the cornerstone, and as a rule, the frontline passes at the public hearings, and many people have witnessed such a situation. Thus, after the confrontation has become clear, the authorities, local authorities as a rule, start to make up their mind what parties should be supported by them. The project is interesting, it will bring money to the budget, and it creates jobs for the citizens. And on the other hand, it has a certain social explosion of activity, of misunderstanding, and it is not clear what they need on a long-term basis with receiving money to the budget and the short-term response that will come to an end sometime later. And the political risk consists in the following: the authority might not always take the decision which on a long-term basis would satisfy the interests, the public interests. And in this case, we have transformation when the authorities decide to close the project. The environmental risk becomes the political risk. As to the legal risk, in principle, that is almost the same. For instance, when some permissive documents were received and approvals have been received, and licenses and so on have also been received, and all of a sudden the public starts to submit suits at the court of law. They contest against the permits and allocation of the land plots for certain reasons, and that interferes with the project. The project becomes more expensive, and it also creates a certain tension in the relations between the project initiators and the persons, the investors who provide equity or quasi-equity debt capital. So the legal risk slowly but surely would become the legal risk. So the expropriation, these are the actions of the authorities to interfere with the activities of the company. I personally and my partners believe that the long-term expropriation should be determined as the activity aimed at getting part or the entire value added generated by the project by a person who is either not a project participant or is a project participant in excess of the primary or available contract agreement, or for the with the purpose of changing such agreement. So that will be to the benefit of the expropriate or the affiliated persons.
The compensatory measures are the measures that are taken within the framework of the project initiation, and when there is an environmental pressure, so to speak, and the compensatory measures are suggested, like the cleaning of the water basins and treatment of wastewater, which increases the cost of the project, leads to higher costs, and or there might be requests to build sports grounds or kindergartens. The minimization of the environmental risks is closely associated with proper information, with a support group for the project, with the compensatory measures that I have already mentioned, additional measures aimed at the boosting of the public benefits, and in relation to the corporate social responsibility, there must be a choice of another plot of land. That is also a solution of the problem, and the more scrupulous attitude to the legal matters, such as proper coordination, permits, and licenses. We had a specific case when we promoted construction of a facility for the manufacturing of the components for low-rise housing construction, 40 million project in Russia, not that big, but quite significant for that particular area. The region was very much dependent on donations, and the budget revenues from tax collection associated with this project actually leveled out the deficit of the budget. So all the coordination was carried out, the permits were received, but the allocation of the plot of land and the selection of the plot of land procedures were also completed. The project was based on green technologies, certified in the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States. The hazardous emissions were very low, zero actually. Water was not used. So by all the documents, there was no impact on the environment. And then there was the public opposition. One of the initiators brought together a group visiting local facilities, local plants, collected about 500 signatures, and sent papers to all the public authorities, even to the president. And so the whole project was stalled. So what we suggested was a whole set of compensatory measures, the cleaning of the rain drains, and so that they could be treated with the help of the factory wastewater treatment facilities, cleaning of the 12 hectares nearby, planting greenery, and additional training programs for the young people. So there was a wide range of different measures suggested, and the margin as a result was reduced considerably. And nonetheless, the project was stalled and even stopped at the public hearings, and it became clear that at the same period of time, in the same region, 3 other investment projects were actually killed, we might put it that way, for similar reasons. So what are the conclusions we came up with, the conclusions that could be interesting for the professionals in the market? There are no clear-cut environmental standards that do not lead to double interpretation, and that cannot be used as levers in association with specific projects. Then it is necessary to develop these very clear environmental standards. It is necessary to change the mechanism of administrative decision-making process based on these environmental standards. And I actually want to say that very often the public opposition is using this following slogan: and what if? What if? And there must be calculations prepared that indicate what the probability of these consequences is. And this is similar to what the insurers do. So the ratio, the coefficient is calculated, the percentage, the probability of these negative consequences. And each and every project should carry out a certain expert examination, providing the metrics indicating the possibility of the negative consequences and their emergence. And these metrics should be definitely correlating with the existing legislation, and there must be certain criteria of selection. Let's say the project can be recommended, additional public hearings are required, and the third option, denial. So if the project is in the first category, when it is recommended, then the local authorities should have a responsibility for that. They shouldn't take away their signatures, and they should be responsible indeed. They should cover the damages. They and should be legally responsible and liable, and the binding effect for them should be always there in place. Thank you. Thank you, Kirill. Your conclusions are quite interesting, and allow me to give an example. comparing the situation with a car that can cause traffic accidents, and it does not mean at all that all the cars should be banned. And thus, if the public hearings are turning into an elements of black competition, as you say, as an attempt to stop industrial development. It does not mean at all that the public hearings should not be used. It's an instrument, and it was interesting for me to hear that this instrument can be improved through digitization. We're saying that there are certain criteria of assessing the impact on environment, and these criteria can be digitized, and then we either make a conclusion that it's dangerous, it's hazardous, it's a threat, or not, and any idea of voluntarism here is exhausted. We have a system of coordinates as a result. And this is true. There must be a legal foundation for this assessment. Thank you very much. Thank you for your contribution. And since we began with theoretical issues, allow me to give the floor to Rob Ewan. Rob, before you speak, I would like to ask a question. The environmental regulation is definitely a result of the historical development of the system of law. And if we're talking about two models, the Anglo-Saxon system and our national system, in part of a particular case of the shale revolution in the United States. In Russia, it is interpreted in the following way. The shale revolution has become possible due to the liberal environmental regulation, and that's the first thing we should mention. And second, due to the specific regulation of the land relationships, when the owner of the land is not only of the surface of the land, but also of the subsoil, of everything that is under the plot of land. And at the same time, well, of course, I understand that the shale revolution has a certain political aspect to it, and what I read in the open sources, in the discussion materials, mostly is associated with the comments concerning the technologies that can be used due to liberal legal regulation. And on the other hand, of course, the environment is irrevocably damaged. Where is the balance between these two issues? Before you make your presentation, could you answer my question?
Thank you. Fascinating question. I think the key thing in the situation with shale gas exploitation is about the equation of risk and reward. In countries such as Russia and the United States, where generally you have very large land mass and a dispersed population in the areas where the shale gas is being exploited, then the reward that is seen by the companies and the risks that are seen by the population and the authorities in those locations are in favor of the companies exploiting the gas. In countries in Western Europe, where the countries are smaller geographically and more densely populated, and there is maybe a stronger political lobby against shale gas exploitation, then the reward that can be sought by the company and for society is not seen at the moment to be of sufficient value to outweigh the concerns of the local populations about environmental damage and the consequences of that damage to them.
Спасибо за ваш ответ.
Thank you for your answer. Now your presentation.
Thank you. So my presentation comes from a practitioner's perspective of delivering projects and making environmental standards work. First of all, to give people some context about the company I work for, we are an international consultancy and construction company, and we offer services across the full life cycle. So we both work with clients at the inception of projects, when they're putting the framework together, the business case that will generate the project, right the way through to assisting them in the occupation and use of whatever facilities are created. We have some 4,500 staff operating out of 60+ countries around the world, and I've just highlighted there 3 particular projects to give you some sense of the sort of things we get involved in. We led the management of the London 2012 Olympics, which were a highly sustainable Olympic Games and involved the complete regeneration of a large area in East London. We are also currently working on the Kingdom Tower in Saudi Arabia, which at over 1 kilometre high will be the tallest building in the world. And then more locally here, we are working with SPB Renovation on the Gutenberg project, which is a $1 billion US plus residential development to the southeast of St. Petersburg, involving some 13,600 apartments. So what about MACE and the environment? Our objective is to be a leader in sustainable environmental practice. How do we do that? We do that by planning our impacts and then focusing on how we improve those impacts through design and through the way in which we deliver the projects we get involved in. We also do it by ensuring that we comply with all applicable legal requirements and environmental obligations. Sometimes those environmental obligations will not be captured in any form of legislation. These will be either client-driven desires or trends that can be seen, and therefore obligations arising in order to satisfy any objections that may arise through the planning processes we get involved in. What is the potential in the industry that I operate within? It is massive. The construction and the operation of the built environment generates huge impacts on the environment. It, as an industry, consumes 60% of all materials that man creates on this planet. It also results in 33% of all the waste that we generate and accounts for 45% of the CO2 emissions. So those are UK government statistics, but they are generally replicable when you look at North America and around the world. So how do we, as MACE, focus on delivering against that potential for improvement? Well, it starts with looking at things in the overall design situation. So the graphic you've got in front of you here is actually relevant to the project we're delivering currently here in St. Petersburg, where we have put a lot of time and effort with the client, with the designers, to look at what is the traditional way of doing things versus the new approach that we're advocating, which is innovation in a local context, but is not innovation in a global context. It's simply about using modern materials in a modern way. So the diagram there shows that for the precast solution, which the blocks that you will see in the sleeping belt around St. Petersburg are very commonly precast or in situ mass concrete, has an impact because of the overall weight and nature of the building, which is the red bar you can see there. What's called the hybrid solution, which is a combination of steel and concrete, precast concrete and in situ concrete, takes about 40 to 50% of the overall building weight away, and therefore you end up with a building that is significantly lighter, needs less foundations, and has less embodied carbon simply because you are using significantly less material. So the implications are not only in the benefit of, to the client, a cost reduction, it also ends up with a massive potential environmental impact. And indeed, in many ways, what we're doing is turning the clock back several hundred years, because Peter the Great, when he founded this great city we're sitting in today, realized that the soil conditions here were indeed very poor, and so the buildings that we're sitting in, and what is certainly here in the historical centre, are very light buildings. In that way, they don't impact on the ground and they become very efficient. What happened through the Soviet era was, sadly, buildings got heavier and heavier, and hence the precast solutions that are typical everywhere today. We've had significant issues with the authorities over using something other than concrete, simply because that's what everybody here uses. But we faced up to those challenges, and with the support of the client, and ultimately with the support of, through the expertise process, then we're at the process of moving this building forward, these buildings forward, 1.5 million square metres of them, very efficiently. What also are we focusing on? It's through the modern use of materials. The top image is of a new but precast cladding building, i.e. the outside of the building is precast concrete panels. The bottom building is a building using highly insulated lightweight panels, of which some 7 million square metres are used around the world every year. The images then to your left at the top, the red shows where heat is escaping from the building. The yellow, again, shows the heat. The bluer and the greener the image, then that shows you where heat is being kept inside the buildings. Again, the market here is typically about precast concrete panels, and as you can see, that means in environmental impact terms, not just what we put into the buildings when we're building them, but the buildings through occupation are generally very inefficient, currently designed in the way they are typically done here in Russia and in many other parts of the world today. The bottom version is where we're heading towards, and when the buildings become so well insulated, they become almost passive, i.e. you don't need any input of energy to heat the building, simply through human occupation, through the use of your iPad, your computer, your cooking, you generate enough heat to keep the place warm. How else do we deliver the potential? We deliver it through responsible management. So we set ourselves targets, and we set our targets in combination with the client. And currently, these targets were set now 4 years ago, but for 2015, we are aiming to divert 98% of all waste away from landfill situations. We're aiming to reduce our own emissions in the process of construction by 20%. We procure all materials that we're involved in on our projects from responsible sources, and we're aiming to reduce consumption of water and energy resources by some 20%. And at this point, we are well on track to achieve those results. So in summary, what is our approach to delivering against the environmental standards that we work with? It's about planning our impacts and then focusing on how we improve them. It's always about complying with legislation as a minimum and then aiming to satisfy the obligations that we may find our clients or others wish us to undertake. And the results are improved impacts and therefore generally lower costs. Those improved impacts also generate for both us as a company and typically for our clients the potential for increased returns, because they end up with a better product delivered to better standards, and in that way the buying public in a residential development sense recognise the value in what they are buying and then are prepared to pay what would be a premium price compared to a more traditional approach. Thank you.
Спасибо, Rob.
Thank you, Rob. Coming back to it, thank you for giving important engineering details in your presentation so that we can realize the level of the problem. But coming back to the ideology of St. Petersburg Legal Forum, which tries to be the precursor of legislative changes and to channel some of these legislative channels in the correct direction for the public benefit and for the business. I would like to ask you, probably you will be able to illustrate this question using the experience of your company or proceeding from the knowledge of regulation in other countries in respect of environmental regulation in countries other than Russia. There are technologies available, energy-saving technologies and different improvements. On the other hand, the notion of business conservatism is existent. The business is not ready to use a certain technology because it is expensive to buy the technology or to buy a license. And secondly, that will make the problem more expensive and economically non-efficient, not defending extensive capitalists to build everything with hazardous objects and to undermine the environment. But I would like to hear the answer from you, the answer to the question, how can reasonable behavior of the state look in the situation of soft imposition of correct technologies? This is a system of penalties, the simplest procedure of the system of taxation. So, proceeding from your experience, where do you see the possibility of development on the legal plane, or probably this sphere doesn't need any incentives provided by the state in the form of repressions, and probably this question, this problem can be solved using economic tools. And what are these tools?
I think the starting point has to be that less than 20% of the environmental impact of construction projects, be they infrastructure or building projects, is actually in the building phase. 80% of the impact will be in the use of the building through its lifetime. Therefore, it's vital that clients in developing projects focus on what the use of the building will be, not just what it costs to build it. That then has to start, in my experience in many countries around the world, with standards being set through legislation, which are a minimum requirement for companies, developers or end users to meet whilst they are configuring and creating their project from the outset. Then during the process of construction, again, it is only regularly appropriate to ensure that there is an economic cost to, for instance, the production of waste material, such that then developers and constructors then focus on the minimization of waste, both through design and through the way in which they undertake the work. So by putting a ruble cost, a dollar cost, a pound cost against things like taking materials to landfill, then people can innovate to ensure that they reduce the amount of packaging that is put around products that are incorporated into projects. As well as then just through design minimizing the whole aspect of waste as well. So it always needs a level of underlying legislation that then puts the requirement into a monetary form that is not a penalty, but is a cost that then people will seek to simply reduce through appropriate means and not just inappropriate.
Thank you for your answer. Dear colleagues, I address the audience now. We can divide our discussion into two parts. We have discussed some common things, such as public participation in solving environmental problems, or the use of new technologies and incentives for using these state-of-the-art technologies. If there are any questions to Kirill or Rob, please ask your question. If you want to make some remarks, you're most welcome. I'm ready to give the floor to you before we pass on to the second part of our discussion today. Please, you will receive the microphone now. Please introduce yourself. Evgeny Derevyankina. I'm director of the practice of environmental law at the National French Company Legal Sin. And I would like to share my experience concerning the golden middle between the industrial development and environmental protection. There is a system in place, for instance, in France, before opening some project, the industrial company offers to the state a certain solution in respect of the pollution that they are going to generate, and they offer certain protective or compensatory measures, and there are public hearings organized on the project, the processing of the information, certain conclusions are drawn, and as a result, a solution is offered, whether the project is adequate in respect of its economic purposes and the environmental protection that it might result in, whether it is worth implementing at the initial starting point of the project. You might formulate a certain opinion whether we'll proceed further or not, whether we'll receive a permit or not. So the companies are not just guessing whether they are setting up a certain production facility or something might interfere later in the process and will change the situation. If at the first stage a permission was given, the situation will not be affected and the production facility will run in accordance with the scheme determined by the state as the correct scheme at the initial basic stage. So I think that there is a simple solution of that question. We just have to improve the regulation. As to ratification on behalf of the state, we shouldn't forget that there is such a serious force as the community and about the environmental bodies, Greenpeace and other environmental bodies which have an active position that is quite obvious. Having all the sanctions delegated by the state for drilling and so on. I'm not going to discuss piracy. Having all the licenses for offshore developments, some ex-company might come across a rather active position of the well-known environmental body. Coming back to the question of balance, how should the state respond, or private or public company respond to such activity? For instance, you can state that we have passed all the procedures, everything is packed and everything is clean, and you could make your remarks, and remarks you made, and now your activities are either to defend someone's interests or that self-activity. So what is happening in other countries? For instance, according to the French law, if the third party has lost the possibility to make their statements at a certain moment during the project development, its actions are piracy actions, and the state will defend the industrial company, because in this case, if the third party is discontent, it will not attack the industrial company, but the state that gave such a permission. So the state would support the industrial company in this particular case, and primarily the state will be defending, and then the industrial person will be defending. So the state is a defender of business in this particular case. Thank you, dear colleagues. Will you please get the mic? Good afternoon. Sibur, the Parliament of Bashkortostan Republic. I like the presentation of Kirill. That was a very good presentation. And appealing to the previous colleague asking the question, I would tell you that the Russian reality has its specific features. We have a similar problem at Karnashpan facility. A land plot was allocated and the permission was granted. However, the public said no. and they opposed it. And now we have presidential elections, and the opposition will lose it in its for its purposes. We talked with the people who came there. That is an investment project. So we talked with the investors. We asked them whether the environmental expert examination was conducted. They said not. What is the purpose of it? We have approved. We have agreed on everything, and as a result, now they carry out quickly the environmental expert examination, but the public doesn't believe the experts. And here, in the Russian reality, that might undermine the position of other investors because the environmental problems might become a barrier for attracting the funds to certain regions. If there is some problem related to the environmental protection, it is difficult to have negotiations with investors. They will be afraid of losing the money. So environmental protection is an important factor. Thank you. So I give the floor to Lyubov Deko, since you are going to talk on the analysis of current regulation, and you are going to give a certain forecast for the future in the light of our present discussion. What forecast will you give for the future? As to the forecast for the future, in my view, it is related with approval of the new regulatory acts and implementation of the standards and the regime of mutual relations with business community and with the public at large and with the experts. Without asking for the opinion of the business authorities and public organizations, it is not possible to have a unified solution for everyone. That would be impossible. As to the general trend of the state in this direction, it has been traced, but it is not quite explicit at present, and I will discuss it in my presentation. You think that the compromise is possible, and all the instruments that we have been discussing now, primarily public control and then state regulation, will not exclude this compromise between the community and business. I think this compromise should exist, otherwise someone will be suffering and the interests will be infringed. So we have to look for the compromise, and the task of the state is to ensure and to organize the process. In my view, there are two basic aspects of modern environmental policy based on advanced global experience. One of these aspects is formation under modern conditions of individual motives for the business subjects. These might be positive and negative motives and incentives, which I'm going to discuss in my presentation later. And the second aspect consists in the necessity of successive use of the approach principal agent, and I will briefly explain what this means. The principal or the customer is the state in the person of the bodies of environmental policy that would like to attain a certain quality of the environment, taking into account the fact that the agent or business or executor is primarily interested in getting the maximum benefits and pure revenues. The agents or executors are economic subjects which, acting in their own interests, at the same time ensure the attainment of the purpose formulated by the state. Let us now discuss the mechanisms and instruments of ecological policy of the state in interrelation with business. Here we might speak about the instruments of direct and indirect regulation. Among the main instruments of direct environmental economic regulation are environmental standards or norms and moral impact. As to the moral impact, it involves providing the incentives in case of the worthy environmental activity, or scolding in case the environmental legislation is being infringed. However, these factors are related with many aspects, social, cultural aspects, and psychological aspects. So we are not going to discuss them. We are going to discuss the law and economy. The following aspects are quite important. Environmental standards and norms, which are shown in the slide. I am not going to list them now. Now I would like to pass on to the most interesting part of my presentation. I think that the instruments of indirect environmental economic regulation are of particular interest in this case. Being a member of the Presidium of the Russian Society of Nature Protection and Law, I have analyzed some global practices and I came to certain conclusions. Unfortunately, the regulatory base of the Russian Federation at present for forming the economic interest of business and social and environmental responsibility in Russia is not adequately developed. Though in the federal law on environmental protection, there is Chapter 4, Environmental Regulation in the sphere of environmental protection. Most of the norms are of declarative nature, and in the laws and other regulatory acts of the federal level, there are no norms of providing the economic incentives for the economic entities. And I think this trend is quite important. And it is good if the state takes a more active role in that process. The main instruments of indirect environmental economic regulation are environmental taxation, environmental subsidy. I will just list the instruments which I think are quite important, proceeding from the global experience, and they're directly applicable in Russia if we transform the legislative base, and it is quite realistic in our reality.
So environmental subsidy is a payment. It's actually a tax benefit, which is intended for the acquisition of nature protection equipment or for the implementation of different nature protection measures. Contrary to taxes and fines, the subsidy is a reward, in fact, and an incentive, and promotes environmental activities. Subsidies can be direct or tax. They can be provided in the form of tax benefits and loans at low interest rates. Subsidies can be for the acquisition of nature protection equipment, which reduces the costs of the polluting company introducing new technologies, and the subsidies for the reduction of the level of pollution as compared to the permitted levels. Then there is another trend, environmental taxation. It's a new approach. So what is good about this process? It makes the source of pollution to recognize the environmental damage inflicted, to pay for it, for the damage, and thus makes it possible to consider that as a cost. And the emitter in this case is pushed towards the improvement of environmental technologies, which definitely leads to lower impact, and the costs are lower, and at the same time that particular entity doesn't have to pay the respective emission tax. Of particular importance is environmental crediting, the special interest rates, accelerated amortization of equipment for nature protection, and the pledge price. And these conditions can be beneficial, and they can be also discriminatory, and thus and the organization that is involved in nature protection work has a right to expect a credit, a loan, for the equipment acquisition or for manufacturing at lower interest rate, and with simplified procedures without any extra conditions attached, collateral or any sort of warranties and guarantees. And discriminatory conditions are applied to those companies that are violating the environmental legislation and the requirements of environmental ecological safety and security. The accelerated depreciation is the transfer of the cost of the capital to the cost of services and products. And in case of the nature protection equipment, the time can be reduced by 50%, which definitely is an incentive for companies. What is the pledge price? It's an alternative to taxation, and there is an advance payment considered for the case of pollution. And if the pollution was prevented, then this deposit actually goes back to the company, which makes it possible to avoid the undue dumping and waste. And there is an incentive for the company that wants to get this deposit back without polluting the environment. Then next, quite an interesting trend, environmental insurance. The polluting company pays, compensating the damage resulting from different incidents and accidents, and makes it possible to accumulate the compensation payments of the companies in the insurance funds of the potentially polluting companies. All over the world, the environmental insurance is quite well developed, and as far as I know, different investment projects take this in, and in certain countries there is a mandatory requirement for environmental insurance. In Russia, unfortunately, the implementation of environmental insurance is really hampered, since there are no federal approaches, federal methods designed for that particular type of insurance. And I also wanted to add one other important thing. An important element of responsibility for entrepreneurs is certification for the compliance with environmental standards. These are standards associated with environmental management, auditing, and there are Russian systems of standards that today are quite often used, and the bona fide and social responsible businessmen these days do follow the standardization systems in Russia. And today they correspond directly with the norms of international law. And among the Russian standards, we can mention the, I'm not going to list them really, the resource protection measures is one of them. Just as an example of international cooperation, I would like to mention one particular case, which is also a very good platform for the discussion of these matters, and that's what we're doing today. It's the Global Covenant of the United Nations. It's a platform for cooperation, coordination, and discussion at the level of the United Nations, business sectors, governments, and all the major organizations, with the purpose of tackling sustainable development problems of the society. Sustainable development is impossible without the nature protection and environmental protection. As for the local approaches, there is the Gulf of Finland project between Russia, Finland and Estonia over this year. And this is another platform for discussion of different issues. And as a result, the countries address their governments with the purpose of tackling certain problems and considering different aspects of proper legal regulation. Finally, I would like to say that at present, in contemporary Russia, the public policy and the business strategy are being corrected and updated, which is in the basis of the public policy and business strategy of the Russian Federation for the period of time up to 2030, which clearly stipulates that one of the mechanisms of the environmental protection is the raising of the ecological and social responsibility of businesses. And present, the law on the public environmental control is being drafted, and the president of the Russian Federation requests its speedy approval and adoption. And we do believe that the work carried out by the state, all the positive intentions lead us to further steps. We'll have to carry out a lot of work. Thank you very much, Lyubov. In view of your presentation, I would like to ask a question. One question to Kirill and to Rob. Now, Lyubov listed the instruments, including the instruments of public-private partnership, such as subsidies, tax benefits with properly understood and clear-cut purpose, the minimization of environmental impact. You, both of you, are involved in real sector projects. Rob, you mentioned in your presentation the London Olympics. I wonder if you had this type of experience of cooperation with the municipalities, with the authorities, and Kirill, when you work, when you consult your clients, when you give them consultation, and when you come across some information concerning public sector subsidies, then I wonder if this improves the project, if this makes the project more attractive for the investors. What is the dynamics here?
With particular reference to the London Olympics, clearly that was a publicly funded, a government-funded project. And the way in which that project worked was that targets were established at the early stages of the project that were shared targets between the companies involved in the delivery of the games and those from the public sector and the local authorities surrounding the Olympic Park that would be acceptable to them and the general public in that area. There were then implications if those targets were not met, whereby there were penalties and additional taxes due if those targets were not achieved. However, if they were achieved, then there was a further shared financial benefit of savings that was allocated between the parties involved. So there was a positive incentivization to hit the targets and go beyond, whilst there was also a penalty if targets were not met. Those were shared targets in every sense.
Спасибо.
Thank you. On my part, I can say that it's a rather interesting question that you asked, and it's a global question. Since there are two approaches, the structure, well, there is a financial component in the transaction and there is a legal component in any transaction. And professionals do not have just one opinion, what comes first, chicken or egg. So if the public sector provides a credit, a loan, or a subsidy, this has a direct association with the financial model and theoretically makes the project more attractive and has an impact on the positive output of the project. As for the legal viewpoint, these are risks that I have mentioned. Why are they so important? Because we attract foreign investments, and the contracts are built on in the following way. Let's say there is a company in Russia that initiates a project, and there is a company outside the Russian jurisdiction intentionally created. Then there are investors, foundations, or some other layer entity collecting money and then investing money, accumulating money, investing money into this foreign SPV. So at the level between SPV and the investor, as a rule, we've never come across anything different. There is a principle of the English law in force, and there are warranties, there are representations there, and the warranties and representations address every risk immediately. So if the state is on the side of the receiver, provides certain guarantees for the investor, which can be also guarantees for political risks, risks against warranties against expropriation, then of course it's a very serious advantage. But what is the difficulty here? All of this, well, how should I put it? As a rule, the state takes certain steps only after certain problems emerge. And we have this gap between the drafting of the original legal documents when we work with the investors, because there are certain risks that are not properly addressed. They're not that clear yet. And then we have to continue working on the documents that originally were drafted. So there is a principle of that wheel, in a way. I'm trying to structurize what I have just heard. If we're talking about a well-respected state, then of course there is an active standpoint and there is the position of post-monitoring. The proactive position is associated with the stimulation of businesses and minimization of environmental impact through different measures and through the sanctions. If we talk about the post-monitoring, then of course we all know what that means. We all follow what is happening in this field, and we all know that in any state, including the Russian Federation, the public sector is open and ready to engage in a dialogue and establishes partnership relations, partners relations. Let me remind you of Medvedev being president at the time, visiting one of the Sibur facilities. When we talked to him about the negative environmental heritage in our company as a result of numerous transactions associated with its foundation in the days when the new economy just began to develop in our country, came across the environmental problem of the White Sea. And President Medvedev then had to take certain measures, and the recultivation of this sludge cultivator basin and reservoir is being carried out now. So our question is about this heavy Soviet heritage, Roman. The question is to you. In those days, the Soviet state did not have time really to think about all these environmental impacts because there were financial difficulties. And then with the emergence of the new economy, with its development, with the emergence of new companies, new industries, new sectors, and changes in the existing sectors, these problems accumulated in the Soviet days became the problems of private companies, and not just private companies. These are, generally speaking, the problems that business comes across. So when investigating this problem, are you more optimistic and you think that the public sector listens to the business, or is your attitude somewhat different and you can see many more open questions in this field? As you say quite correctly, the historical heritage is very topical for such sectors as the sector we work in, energy sector, mining industry, processing industry in general. As you know, in our country, with the rate of growth that were required in the days of Stalin in order to fulfill the targets set during the Petiletkas, the 5-year periods, there appeared some cities which are pitiful indeed. The 1990s, the time when so much changed in the economic life, many of these were abandoned. The new owners decided not to even care about them. The bankrupts.
So there are some abandoned facilities that contaminate the environment, for instance, different dumps and lakes with sludge that are not recultivated. And answering your question, I can tell you that the state is hearing it and it takes some attempts to provide the incentives in different way for solving the different environmental issues. In all the respects, it is quite obvious. So for instance, in China, they have the same story as we had previously. If you have visited Beijing, you will notice that it is impossible to breathe there. And our state is thinking about environmental protection now. And now there is a federal target program that will probably make it possible to solve it. And there is a mechanism of private-public partnership. But our state is reasonable, and it provides benefits and penalties simultaneously. As to the historical pollution and contamination, the state provides incentives for the companies who liquidate this heritage, including the administrative measures. For instance, as to our company, production facility in Moscow, we are currently being summoned at the court of law, and based on the court decision, will have to pay 1.4 billion rubles. That is a rather high penalty. That's my answer. If you allow, I will pass on to my presentation and I will introduce myself. I'm a Director of Department for Legal Support of Corporate Projects, projects of Gazprom Neft Company. My name is Roman Kvitko. I like the structuring of our today's roundtable discussion. It is similar to the American film by Robert Zemeckis, Back to the Future. So we started with the current situation and with the future and future technologies that will make it possible for us to reduce the environmental damage. And we discussed the current situation related to startups at the initial stage of business development, and I'm going to discuss the past, and then I will come back to the future. As to the past, it was rather problematic from the viewpoint of environmental protection. No one was thinking about environmental protection then, and we have to recognize, even according to the official data in Russia, due to the inventory of different facilities related to environmental damage, we have revealed a lot of giant objects with more than 400 million tons of pollution, and they have a negative impact on more than 70 million persons. Well, probably we haven't checked everything, and not everything is checked, is taken into account. I would like to repeat once again that people are thinking about it. There is the draft law that is formulated here. There is a federal target program that has been developed, and there are a lot of billions of rubles allocated. The mechanism of private-public partnership has been developed to solve the problem. The only thing that I would like to mention is the state is mainly concerned, and the business will have to affect it. The state is mainly concerned about the abandoned sites that might pollute the environment. It is not thinking about the cases when the pollution is in the territory of the owners. As you understand, these pollutions didn't form today. For instance, as to the Moscow refinery, in its territory, there was a settling point to which the waste was removed. That was in 1955, and that facility was built in this way. Probably that was a primitive technology, but the facility operated in this way. Then, at that time, it didn't contradict our standards or norm, at least those that were applicable at that time. What happened later? Let us try to understand who should be responsible for what happened in 1955. The owner, the present-day owner, or the past owner? Probably we have to formulate it in this way. How to help the current owner to solve the problem, because if we recalculate it in monetary terms, that might kill the business. Moreover, of course, recultivation, we can remove and bury the waste. That costs money, but it can be bearable. What happens later? You remove it, but Rosprirodnadzor comes and says you had an illegal storage facility, but we have removed everything, but you have also to pay the penalty for the negative environmental impact, for instance, 1.5 billion rubles. As to the cost of these ponds, we have reconstruction, we have built treatment plants, we have recultivated and had landfill waste. In addition to the administrative penalties of hundreds of thousands of rubles, we also have to pay 1.4 billion rubles. Thus, should the state not provide the incentives to those who try to eliminate those historical contaminations in the territories which currently just landfills with waste? Probably the money that has been spent by the company should be taken into account. It should be offset. There is no methodology of determining the historical accumulation of waste. So, for instance, according to the law, what emerged from 1991, no payment should be levied. But I say, dear friends, how are we going to determine it? Let us sum up what appeared later. For instance, if we have recorded it in 2013 that is recognized as assigned to 2030, and there is no real methodology and how Rosprodnadzor should make these measurements. For instance, that settling point or buffer pond, it is not just a swimming pool, that is not a cube or a parallelepiped, that has a shape that is not related with geometry. Quite often, such structures are natural ponds or natural lakes which existed in the past. If it has a cubic form, you can easily calculate the volume. You can multiply the depth by the width and the height, and you get the volume, and you might multiply it by the density of the substance and get the total amount of sludge kept there. But it is, if it is not cubic or parallelepiped, could use the ultrasound devices to count it. But no one thinks about it, and you take just approximate values and multiply them. On the other hand, the court was quite critical. You haven't determined the volume and there is no precise data. And the expert assessment has not given anything. They were using the spade to take samples. They were not packaging those samples. I don't know what kind of expert examination that is just done by eyewitnessing. How they measure the depth. The depth is 7 meters and just stick to measure is only 3 meters. How have you measured it? We have attached the second stick to that measuring rod. But all the arguments disappear in the court, and there is de facto presumption of being guilty versus the official presumption of being non-guilty. So they have determined the fact of contamination, and you have to prove everything. That is not realistic. Thus, there is no competition, and the coefficient increases multiply, and the Rospotrebnadzor doesn't even prove that it comes only once and not once in 6 months. This is the real situation at present. What incentives the company has to combat it? As only moral incentives and no other incentives whatever. Being a public company, being a state company, being an owner who's responsible, owners of the company in the territory of Moscow, of course we cannot afford to be environmentally unfriendly. That's why we're doing it. But there are no incentives. There is an old law stating that the environmental investments into environmental measures might be offset against the payment for the negative environmental impact. But there is no relevant methodology, no system, and we even don't understand what body is doing it. And this decision might not even be taken by the court of law. Thus, I would like to discuss and to propose the following. What should we do so that while combating for the cleanliness of the environment, we would really discuss and solve serious environmental problems? What should we do to take into account not only the interests of the state and not only the interests of the society in general, but the interests of the economic entities which solve these questions with their hands directly? I don't think that it is too difficult. We just, the Constitutional Court stated that when nominating, when determining the penalty and when determining the degree of guilt, you have to take into account the issue of commensurality, and you have to differentiate and individualize the responsibility. You shouldn't have the common approach, giving giant penalties to those companies that can pay. For instance, sometimes the company won't be able to pay and other companies won't be able to pay at all. So we shouldn't be too strict in this respect, and we presume that we have to, the state has to urgently think about drawing up the procedure of offsets against the environmental measures. For instance, if we build treatment plants, probably the payment for the negative environmental impact which is levied from us in this case should be offset against our expenses, because the treatment facilities are much more expensive than this payment for environmental impact. But so far we haven't yet solved the problem. And there is a principle: you shouldn't pay twice for the same thing. As to the key proposal, that is not the idea of our company. That idea has been formulated long ago. That is environmental amnesty, create the conditions when it is economically efficient for the owner to liquidate the historical environmental damage. So the state should not be punishing. It is more advantageous for the state if everything is sold and the environmental damage is liquidated, and the procedures that are economically viable are more efficient. And you have to invent something just to attain the benefit for the owner, at least so that it wouldn't result in the losses for the owner. So I have some specific proposals in this connection. It should be noted that the state is discussing that theme at a rather high level. Unfortunately, so far, that hasn't been developed as a specific regulatory act, but in 2010, Dmitry Anatolyevich Medvedev discussed the issue of environmental amnesty, according to which the company that assume a strict obligation in respect of liquidation or damage or environmental improvement of the sites where the facilities are located will to them, the measures of environmental amnesty will be applied, but no practical steps have been taken. What can we regard as parts of the process? What elements and what formulas should be available? The methodology should be quite simple. The owner, for instance, our company, voluntarily states that he has certain contamination and provides that information to the authorized body, and he receives a grounded and rational time limit for liquidating the damage. No penalties are leveled and no punishments are exerted, and no elements of the state coercion are applied. The owner recultivates at his own expense or based on private-public partnership, depending on the extent of recultivation. So he liquidates that environmental damage in kind, and thus the program has to be approved by the public authorities, and that is reasonable. And after that, the process is finalized, and he submits the results to the state for the state approval. And later from that company, no payments are levied for the negative environmental impacts. He doesn't pay any penalties or fines. If he doesn't reach the results that were formulated, the payment should be levied. I think it is quite reasonable. I don't know why it hasn't yet been implemented. These are the proposals that I wanted to formulate, and I'm ready to answer your question. Thank you, Roman, for your presentation and for the recommendations. I think that this is an important element of the entire St. Petersburg Legal Forum. If you have any questions, you are most welcome. Andrei, Office of Lawyers Region Service. I have a question to all the speakers. Don't you think that the main risk which we have discussed is a risk that the state in principle is not ready for private partnership relations, not from the viewpoint of jurisprudence, because the regulatory base which we're working now just condemning, as was mentioned by Roman, the principle of objective imputation. And I think from all the examples you can see that first the state attracts business so within a certain framework, and there are negotiations with representatives of the authorities. And all of a sudden, after the social agreement has been signed, the controlling bodies emerge, and each of them lodges its own requirements, and the state moves aside. And then they use the promulgation procedure and real public hearings when the people do not understand what will happen in future. We understand that we are not environmentalists, at best we are financiers or lawyers. As to the environmental service in our country, it is not adequately developed. For instance, MPC for air or for water and MPS for water for fisheries. Who has ever checked them? And that announcement of the future national standards, I think, is the main risk. How, under such conditions, when you discuss the risks are not just to arrange a garden, but after the company builds this production facility, it might appear from the viewpoint of law to be illegitimate on behalf of the controlling bodies. Don't you think that the Russian Federation, the subject that is interested in attracting business and private policy, is not ready for the process? May I formulate a couple of ideas? I will briefly answer. I will support you. First, not in the environmental sphere, but in the construction sphere, there is an experience of successful private-public partnership. At least in St. Petersburg, you know that all the road construction facilities are arranged in such a way. For instance, the airport. So there is some positive experience. Secondly, in addition to these approaches and stiffness, in reality, we are concerned with the following. There is an impression that environmental aspects become the projects that add money to the budget. For instance, the payments which were made or which are made by some companies are not used to restore or to liquidate the environmental damage. We're just paying money to the budget as a revenue tax. Hence, that doesn't fulfill its direct role, just supplements the budget. If we want to earn money, if the state approaches it as a source of revenues, probably you're right in that case. But I think if the public policy is formed duly, if they proceed from other purposes and objectives that are really needed, everything will be doomed to success.
And that's what we're working for, the large companies that we represent, since we are, they listen to us, and that's why I was so categorical when answering your question. Thank you. And Alexander Tsipkin, I'm Lubov's colleague. My question is to Kirill. You mentioned that it's necessary to use the insurance companies and their risk assessment in order to turn all this into the legal instruments. What do you mean by that, actually? Allow me to answer another question first. In principle, there is a progress, and it's noticeable. In our specific case, after a time, the parties began to understand that it's easier to go back to this project, to probably to change the attitudes, and the legal aspects concerning the environmental issues were considered, but differently. So the project that initially was threatened is being reanimated, and we hope that it proceeds. As for the comparison, now, in the United States, we are buying debts associated with the pledge of commercial property. And sometimes there are some assets, industrial assets, and there is a soil contamination associated, let's say, with these assets. The current owner, if we take the United States, and my colleague might correct me, of course, but as far as I know, the one who is there in place, the last owner, in whose presence, so to speak, the contamination was discovered, has to pay. So if the owner discovers that there is some contamination, he stops paying the debt back, understanding that he will never be able to cover all the debts. And the bank disposes of that particular property and tries to sell it. And then there is another investor who assesses the risks and the opportunities, and he acts as a knight in shining armor. And then the pollution, the contamination is more expensive than the assets, and then all the problem turns into the problem of the public sector, and then they start looking for the culprit. I wouldn't say that everything is that clear there. No, there are problems indeed. For example, we employ the variant that we believe to be optimal. Just take out everything. No, if the question is not asked through the microphone, interpreters cannot hear it at all. So these are very specific cases, and we're talking about very general trends. And so Alexander's question then next. I think everything should happen at the stage of the project initiation. There must be a matrix there. Any project is insured. There are insurers who insure the risk of environmental accidents, and they have a lot of experience accumulated. Some have 30 years of experience behind them. And statistically, all this is process, so to speak. And so the public sector should just address the insurers, let them share their information, and their model of assessment, risk assessment, should be employed. And on the basis of this matrix, a certain law or a sub-law could be drawn, allowing calculation of these risks. If the risks of contamination are very serious, then we shouldn't. We should remember, of course, what was happening in the past, and we understand that it's very difficult to carry out the remediation. But we should look into the future, understanding what awaits us. My second question is to Rob. Rob, you worked in Saudi Arabia, in Britain, in Russia. Where is it most difficult from the point of view of the environmental standards? What's your opinion, opinion of a businessman? No, we'll be able to understand you.
It's issues of working here in Russia to one side and put a wider perspective on it. I think it's a very mixed picture. Some countries still pay very little attention to environmental issues at all, and simply carry on exploiting and polluting and leaving whatever historical legacies exist untouched. In the more advanced economies of the world, then there is a varying degree of legislation which has to be satisfied. And as Kirill was saying, the responsibility for that legacy in particular is an issue that regularly comes up and affects the business case on the projects that we work on, be they PPP type projects or be they private sector projects. I would have to say that the Western economies where there is a developed infrastructure give you certainty at one level because then you know what standards you have to achieve, you know the rules that you've got to work to, but that typically puts a higher level of upfront cost into the projects, which then may make some of them unviable in the very outset. Where the legislation is less developed and the rules therefore can be worked around or avoided, then potentially the costs are not there. We then have to judge what are we trying to do? Are we trying to address and resolve some of those legacies of the past in moving forward into the modern world, or are we just trying to put them to one side for our children and our grandchildren to pick up in future generations? And at that point, whilst it may be more difficult to work in the Western economies, at least you know what you're dealing with and you're addressing the issues.
Спасибо, коллеги.
Thank you, colleagues. We are to round up our session. Thank you very much. I hope all the information you received was interesting for you. At least it seems to me that the discussion has taken place. Thank you.